Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight we're going to go back to our series of Occult and Crochet. So, for the crochet part, these are some of my little designs. I call them a soap sock. It's kind of like a loofah for your bars of soap. They're 100% cotton, which is really nice. You can just use your bar of soap when it's done, toss it in the wash, and then you can reuse it. I've had the first one of these that I made, and this is my own little design here, is like 3 years old, and I use it pretty consistently. I switch it back and forth with a palm loofah that I use that has it's cotton, but you can use the liquid soaps with it. But if you are a bar soap person, you don't get left out as well. So this one's, like I said, it expands pretty big, so you can actually get the artisan style soaps, I couldn't think of the word, to fit in them, so they can actually, they expand quite a bit. And like I said, machine washable. There's just a little bow tie at the top to cinch it up, keep your soap contained. So those are some of the things I've been working on. Those are on the website, linked in the descriptions, my website, if you're interested in any of those. And now we'll get into the occult part. So we're going to wander back into the French villages of the late 1500s, early 1600s, and meet a Dominican inquisitor by the name of Sebastien Michaelis. And I had to look up how to say his name because it looked easy, the last name Michaelis, but I didn't want to mess it up. So, Sebastian was born in or around the year of 1543, but his youth's history is pretty much been lost. I could not find any main reference to anything going on in his early life. There wasn't even like his father was this, his mother was that, nothing. No sibling information, like zero, which is kind of annoying. But the other thing, that I ran across that made researching this gentleman a little bit more difficult, but it was interesting because I'd only very vaguely heard of this particular thing. His name is the name of an anime character in an anime called Black Butler. I've vaguely heard of this years ago, or recently, whatever you want to call it. There's a manga as well, which I have not read, and I vaguely have heard of the anime, but I hadn't watched it. Really don't know what the purpose of it is, but I was poking around a little bit, and it looks like the character in the anime may have actually been loosely based, on the actual historical person. So if you're into anime, that's an option. Like I said, I haven't seen it, so I cannot speak to how close to reality that may be. But we're going with the witch hunter today. So we're going to bounce forward from his childhood and his birth in around 1543 to a time when he was in his late 30s. And this is where it really starts to infect his history with the witch hunting. And I say infect, not like bad, but like this is where he kind of like comes to prominence. He would be in his late 30s, early 40s, give or take. Today we're doing the, let's turn it so you can see it. It is Island Bliss. It's kind of a tropical flavored one, which is kind of fun. And since it's decided to get cold, I would rather have something that reminds me of warm. So, when Sebastian was in his late 30s, early 40s, he was named Vice Inquisitor of Avignon, which is pretty impressive. I mean, that's quite a ways up in the Dominican line. And between the years of 1581, it has been a long couple of weeks. I don't know if anyone else has just felt kind of perpetually exhausted, but that's where I'm at today. But between the years of 1581 and 1582, he was involved in a series of witch hunts that led to over 14, give or take 14 women being burned at the stake, One source said over 14, others said up to 14, so we'll say 14-ish women being burned. They were all tried and convicted within courts that were a little too influenced by religious doctrine, if you ask my opinion. But this particular experience with these 14 witches really affected Sebastien, and it was shortly after this he would publish his first written paper on demons called I had this said out right earlier. Numenology Discourse Des Espiritus. So basically the number of demons and spirits, or numbers, whatever. I'm not good with translation stuff. But that was published in 1587. So it took him a couple of years because he was trying to put all of his thoughts together, something I'm failing at tonight. But it would eventually be published in 1587. And this little track would actually be the start of a lot of his writings for his career. He wrote a couple of prominent ones for the day. Full disclosure, outside of references in other books, I could not find an English translation really anywhere. There were some really interesting original publications from back in the day, ranging in price from $3,500 up to about $7,000. So, yeah, no. But it would be interesting to be able to actually read some of this in full English, other than just tidbits. Where are we at here? And these writings would actually kind of be the thing that defined him for his day. He was very devoted to the Dominican order. And Sebastien would eventually be named prior of the community at St. Maxim in 1610. And this, you could call it a trigger for some very wild occurrences, which would actually solidify his name as a witch inquisitor and demonologist. The same year that he was confirmed as the prior, he was involved in a possession incident that actually had very long-term repercussions in this area of France. At an Ursuline convent named, oh good grief, Aix-en-Provence, there was a young nun who was diagnosed as possessed. And I had to look this up because I was like, diagnosed? How do you get diagnosed? And during this time, you could actually be diagnosed by a medical doctor as being possessed. She was exhibiting symptoms of thrashing, convulsions, speaking in demonic language, pulling your hair out, things like that. But instead of calling it mental health, like she might have epilepsy or there might be a few other things going on there, she was diagnosed as possession. And so these were some wild times, and honestly, if you go out in public anymore, you start to question if maybe that diagnosis might not need to come back. Anyway, the 19-year-old nun, Madeleine, was from Marseille, and she was actually a child of a very wealthy family, and kind of was a wild child. I did a little digging into her specifically, and it sounded like she had an interesting childhood, and kind of had a crush on a local priest, and her parents were like, oh heck no, girlfriend, you're getting out of here, and shipped her off to this convent several miles away just to kind of stop that. But it didn't really stop anything. So during her diagnosis period, when the doctor was trying to figure out what her problem was, Madeleine would actually accuse her confessor father, the priest that she had the crush on, as the problem. This was Father Louis Gaufridy, Gaufridy, Gaufridy. And he held the title of priest for her parish where her parents were still living, but she'd been shipped away and she was not too thrilled about that. So she made the accusation that he was the problem. She claimed that he seduced her and lured her into the path of the devil through the priest's magical breath. She claimed that his breath was a potent aphrodisiac, which was a gift from the devil when he received his devil's mark. Aphrodisiac breath, that was a new one when I ran across it, but yeah, that was the documentation. This supposed magic breath lured her into all sorts of sexual immorality and perversion and allowed demons to enter her body because the priest, Father Godfrey, was a cannibal, so she claimed, and he practiced the dark art of sodomy and child sacrifice. Like, are you serious? This is ridiculous. But she kind of went wild with her accusations, but she was also convulsing and making lots of noises, so they were like, yeah, there might be something here. And according to Madeline, the demons, who were kind of speaking through her, said that they would only leave if Father Gafferty was converted to true Christianity, died, or was severely punished for his crimes. Really punished for his crimes kind of sounds like a jilted lover to me, but, you know. Madeline claimed that the chief demon that resided within her body was Beelzebub. Of course it was. And she also had Asmodeus and Astaroth just hanging out with her as well. These names, which were a little more common today, were not well known outside of very specific demonic and exorcist circles. So for her to pop off with these two, there might have been something going on there. I'm not going to say yes or no because, well, I wasn't there. So, but it is a little strange that she had those three princes of hell living in her soul. Okay. The local priest tried his best to exorcise the demons, but kind of couldn't do the job. Didn't quite have the spiritual fortitude to push out princes of hell, so he ended up reaching out to the prior of that area. Now we're getting Sebastian back. Sebastian would hear about the situation and actually, because he was an inquisitor, decide to take on the case. He would enlist the aid of another Dominican, a Father Franco, and I chose the more Latin name because the French one I could not get my mouth to say, which was Dompitus. So we're going to call him by Franco. And Father Franco was going to help with the interrogation and possible exorcisms later. The single diagnosis of Madeline actually led to a snowball effect, and not one that anyone would want. Why is my phone going off? Okay, nothing important. It was said that after Madeline was diagnosed with a demon, the other nuns from the same convent would come forward to claim to be possessed as well. This is a weird little tidbit because in 1600, the convent that she was in had 5 nuns. 5. At the time of this situation, it was said that there were 12 nuns, between 8 to 12, again, depending on your source. So we're not talking about a lot of people here, so it wouldn't be that hard to be like, oh, that person's getting attention, so I can. We're not talking about like in the movies where you have these gigantic stone convents with like hundreds of nuns. This was more like a couple of buildings type of a convent. It hadn't really grown that big. It was very young still. So we only had, 8 to 12 people there when she was sent there. It was said that the demons would cause the various nuns to sermonize for hours. Seriously? What demon do you know of that would make a nun preach for hours? I couldn't find out what was the sermon about. So it would be an interesting deep dive if anyone can read French, because the only articles I could find relating to this were in French, and the little translate from Google Translate was not the greatest. So we'll just go with that. There was one nun who was actually similar in age to Madeline, and this was Sister Louise Amira. She claimed to be possessed by a demon named Verin or Verine, and she claimed the apocalypse was nigh. Of course it was. Still hasn't happened, but it's coming. Madeline spoke for Beelzebub and would state that there were over 6,660 total demons possessing the nuns at the convent. That's a couple of demons. That's 6 legions of demons, if we're going to be honest with you. The number was weird, but I mean 666, so that kind of makes sense. But even at that time, that was a known number of the devil, so it could have been, again, she was making it up. But the particular accusation of having over 6,000 demons infesting 8 to 12 nuns would actually lead Father Gofferty to being arrested and drug into being poked, which we've talked about in previous episodes. So he ended up getting poked by a medical doctor, of course, looking for the devil's mark. This particular doctor was a professor of medicine at the University of Aix, or not sure how to say that properly, I even listened to it. But he was poked and prodded for days before they found the particular spots, and in the year of our Lord 1611, the marks were identified and confirmed. Okay. The priest cried out that they were put there without his knowledge, but it didn't matter, and he was taken to court. Later that year, he was led to confess, and you can only imagine the joys of bringing that confession out. And he would actually, by confessing, sign his own death warrant. The council and the judge would make him be publicly tortured by the strappado, which basically led to him being disjointed. Shoulders, elbows, and several spinal pieces, from what I could find, had been disconnected from each other. Couldn't imagine that kind of pain. And then he would blessedly be strangled so that he would be passed out. I don't know if they actually killed him then, but he was strangled to silence and then burned at the stake for the crime of witchcraft and demon meddling. So this was all during the time that Sebastian was doing his interrogations, so he would have seen and been around all of this going on. I'm still kind of confused by how these people thought that this was the way that Christ would do things, but okay. After Father Gofferty would be dealt with, what happened to Madeline and the other nuns? Sebastian and his assistant investigated these alleged possessions, and it was said that once the priest had died, Madeline, within the hour, appeared to have been completely cleared of all her demons. Sure thing. Sister Louise, on the other hand, would remain possessed until her later death, and it was said that she only lived a few more years because the demons racked her body with pain, with contortions, and sounds that should not come from a mortal body is one of the phrases I read. So, not pleasant. There is some intrigue with Madeline, though, because this happened in 1610, 1611-ish. She was 19 or so, 20. But because of her involvement in this, she'd caught the eye of the Inquisitor board, which was headed by the prior of the Dominican order, Sebastien. Sebastien would pass on his curiosity and suspicions of Madeline, and later in 1642, she would be brought up on charges of witchcraft blatantly, not possession, witchcraft. And in 1652, she would be brought up on charges of witchcraft again. Those charges landed her rear end in jail, where she would spend the rest of her days. It was said that she was released to family shortly before her death in 1670 at the age of around 80 years old. So her little trick actually put her on radar that she probably didn't need to be on. Just saying. Sebastian and Dopatus would use the Inquisition events during this time, which I could not find full logs of, mainly because I couldn't find English translations, but they would eventually write a review on that situation. This report eventually became very influential to the occult world, And this is where I have ran across, I didn't realize it was his book, but I've read across sections of this. The report was actually called The Admirable History of Possession and Conversion of a Penitent Woman Seduced by a Magician That Made Her Become a Witch. So this is... This is the English version that was published later on in 1613. The original French version is this one, which looks really cool. And when I was digging around, I did find, like I said, the original publications or second publications, or, you know, it was around that time period. They were old manuscripts. They're not cheap. They were, one of the websites I found was a British auction house, and it was between £3,500 and £4,700. I found one other spot, and it was significantly more than that in American. So these are expensive texts, mainly historical record, but they're still expensive. So the English translation was 1613. I believe the French was originally published in 1612, and it spread very, very wide during that time period. The reason that it was such a fascinating work at the time, and why it made Sebastien someone worth actually digging into a little bit more, was in his work he did a detailed report on the hierarchy of devils named by the various nuns during their exorcisms. Primary of these would have been Madeleine. Most of these names were in French, of course they were, but they appear in many texts now, but back in the day, these were all new names for a lot of the demons, outside of the basics of Beelzebub and Asmodeus and Astaroth. But the rest of them were kind of new for that era. Now, today we probably have heard a lot of these names. I'm sure if you've dug into very much into the occult, you've heard about them. But back in that time, this was not new. Or this was extremely new. Not new. Again, brain no worky today. It was this hierarchy of... the order of the hierarchy that made it unique. It's also how I ended up finding out about these things, is it's in some of the texts that I've read over the years, historical documents and such. I've got multiple books that are about this thick of different occult people, including historical references, and that's where I first heard the name Sebastien, and then I ran across him again recently in other work. So I was expecting to have a lot more details, but he's not as well. He published a lot about demons, not much about himself. So we'll break down his three-tiered hierarchy of the demonic. I do appreciate the fact that he also talks about where these particular demons fell from. This is all information that was gathered from the possessed quote-unquote witches. So this section, actually, this group of people and what happens after this, there may have been actually some demonic feel to this area, so it wasn't just a random one-off. So the first hierarchy includes angels that were once seraphim, cherubim, or ophonium, or the thrones. So this is where our first choir is. And if you look at the list I just gave you, those are pretty high up in the choir of angels. So these were pretty high up individuals. Beelzebub was a prince of the cherubs. He's founder of Hell's Order of the Fly. And according to the possessed, he tempts men with envy. That's kind of a cool little tidbit that they tossed in. Leviathan was a prince of the cherubim, now prince of hell, who tempts people to give into heresy. Asmodeus was a prince of the Ophonium, or the thrones, burning with desire to tempt men to wantonness and ludity. Okay. Berith was a prince of the cherubim. He tempts men to commit homicide and is quarrelsome, contentious, and blasphemous. I think we need to work on getting rid of him again. Astaroth was a prince of thrones who tempts men to be lazy. Well, I know some of that. Verine, who was the one that Louise said that she was possessed by, was a prince of the thrones. He stood just below Astaroth in the hierarchy, and he tempts men with impatience. So, yeah. I hear, road rage. There we go. I just about lost the word. Then we have Gressel was the third prince of thrones, so he's under Astaroth, who tempts men with impurity. Sonilian was the fourth prince of thrones, tempts men to hate. So that's the first hierarchy. And this was broken down in a way that hadn't been done before. That's the reason I'm even mentioning all this. The second hierarchy, and these were angels or demons, now demons, were angels, that were in the powers, dominions, and virtues category. Caro was the prince of the powers. He tempts men with the hardness of heart. Carnival was the prince of powers as well. He tempts men to obscenity and shamelessness. That's an interesting temptation. Oliet was the prince of the dominions. He tempts men to break the vows of poverty. Never understood the vow of poverty, but okay. Rosir was the second order of dominions, tempts men against sexual purity. Again, there's another one we could banish. Belias was the prince of virtues, tempting men with arrogance and women to be vain, raise wanton children in the household, and gossip during masses. Which, that has to be a Catholic thing, or that during that time period, because gossiping during a mass, I'm not sure how that's a giant sin, but okay. The third and final hierarchy was the hierarchy of demons that were angels under the categories of principalities, archangels, and in general, angels. So we have Verrier, the prince of principalities. He tempts men against the vows of obedience. Olivier, who is the prince of the archangels, tempting men with cruelty and mercilessness towards the poor. And this last one, Euvart, who is the prince of the angels at the time of Sebastian's writing. This was believed to have possessed a young novice nun, and this was one of the ones that Madeline herself claimed to have been possessed by, with, Beelzebub and Astaroth and Asmodeus, because, of course, she's going to have the top of the pile, but also the very bottom of the pile as well. There's a whole bunch more. That was just a sampling of some of the more common names. I believe he documented over 100 different ones. It could have been even more. Those are the ones that I can track. So, as you can see, Sebastian, and like I said, the fact that he put which choir was there, where the demons fell from, was just super cool to me. Anyway, it's an interesting deep dive if you wanted to dig into it further. Again, I've only read bits and pieces because it was in other works. I wish they would bring it back in an English translation, because this would be an amazing read. The same year that this book was published, 1613, Sebastian would actually be named the General of the Dominican Order. So he went from prior to general, which is a good jump. And this led him to starting a new community in Paris. So he expanded the Dominican hold over France. Sebastian's reputation with this instance led to other convent possessions that are, some are well known, some are not. Two in particular that I want to mention, because they were the ones that were kind of pushed on all of this. It was said that some of the nuns who were witnesses to the exorcisms of Madeline and Louise in that area, they'd moved on to other convents, and the virus of this possession would spread with them. Sebastian would take under his counsel, because of his position, other spiritual leaders, priests and convent confessors and things like that. Leaders who would discover that the devil was in every convent they went to. Imagine that. And they would return from being around Sebastian and learning what he knew, and they literally saw the devil in every nun. One of these areas was over 600 miles away from Paris, where Sebastian was at the time, and it was in the convent of Saint Bridget. This would also lead to more possessions and witch hunts in France. One of them was in Loudun, and one was in Louviers over the next 20 years. Loudun was first, Louviers was second. And between these two, they didn't execute that I could find. Not saying they didn't, because I didn't poke into them too deeply, but there were many, many people accused of witchcraft in this time. And even though there was not an exact birth for Sebastien, they did have a year of his death, which was in 1618. There's an assumed date of May 5th, so take that or leave it however you want. Sebastien would pass away in the town of Paris, where he had his Dominican community. And like I said, not having an exact birth date, it was estimated he was around 75 years old when he passed. So he wasn't a young buck at that point. What I did find a little bit interesting, and this did actually influence some of the future trials, when Sebastien was doing his interrogation during this time, the nuns were the contributing factor for what he was hunting for. But there was a really unique aspect of these trials that changed at this time. This was the first documented case where they would take a possessed person, put them on the stand, and use their testimony in the court of law. Prior to this, if you were possessed, we're not trusting a word that comes out of your mouth. But at this point, they actually thought this was a good idea. Not sure why. Demons don't exactly tell the truth. But the possessed or condemned were just basically condemned. If you were possessed and they couldn't get the demon out of you, you're done. Now they were being used as witnesses. They could actually take a confession from a possessed person, and this would be used as evidence against the person who supposedly infected them with the demon. So, like Madeline's confession would have been used against Father Gofferty as a way to help condemn the man. Then he confessed under, I can only imagine what kind of torture, if they were disjointing him as part of his execution. So yeah, it was not a pleasant time, and I'm not exactly sure how I feel about the use of a possessed person's witness statement. That sounds a little sketch to me, but it was the first time that, from what I could understand, it looks like it only went on for 100 or so years. Basically, it wrapped up the trials when you hit about mid-1700s. They're like, we're not taking the confession of a currently possessed person and using that as evidence. That doesn't make any sense. But so that's kind of the information I could find. Like I said, it was a little bit of a pain trying to find Sebastien Michaelis information that didn't have to do with Black Butler. But what he did contribute was a very detailed list of demons and hierarchies and how they were broken down to the world of the occult, and it actually helped influence future demonologists and exorcists, because they were able to kind of hone down where different demons were. And if you were a first hierarchy demon coming from the Seraphim, Cherubim, and Ophanim, you were going to need a lot more than just a standard priest. That's what your second and third levels were for your everyday priests. The big dogs, you needed bishops and stuff like that, is kind of how it worked out later. So having such a detailed list was of vast importance to the various future exorcists. At the time, it was unique because no one had ever done it. They'd never seen it before. But after that, it actually started to play kind of important roles. And those of you who are into a little bit of the darker side of the occult will recognize a lot of this hierarchy breakdown from other grimoires that came after the fact. So this actually turned out to be a rather influential person that no one's ever heard of. So worth kind of looking into a little bit. What I could find is what I brought forward for you guys. Those of you who can read French, there's information out there. I don't read French, so it was a little bit of a challenge. With that, I will wrap this one up. It is the 1st of December. Sorry about that. I've got too many notes here. 1st of December, so I will be bringing up the monthly readings on YouTube and Odyssey here shortly. And then if you are also interested in some interesting gifts, it's just Christmas time, you can check out my website. I've got a couple of different styles. I've got orgones, several crocheted projects, and then a couple of different services. I'm redoing a little bit of my tarot section. It's going to be pre-recorded videos that are uploaded and unlisted to YouTube or Odyssey, depending on which one you guys would prefer. So if you're interested in stuff like that, you can either shoot me a message on my website, or you can comment down below and let me know your thoughts, feelings, and opinions. As long as we're respectful, that's really all we can ask for in this world, right? With that, I'll let you guys go. Have a great, safe, and try to stay warm month of December.